مساء الخير وأهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من واشنطن أونلاين. معي أنا هدي العويس. من جديد تصدر قانون قيصر المشهد السوري ليثير جدل كبير مع الزلزال المميت الذي ضرب شمال غرب سوريا الأسبوع الماضي. دعوات وحملات كثيرة أطلقها ناس سوريين ومهتمين بالشأن السوري دعت إلى رفع العقوبات وإبطال قانون قيصر. فهل تدفع الكارثة الطبيعية الأخيرة التي تسبب بها الزلزال إلى رفع العقوبات عن سوريا وإنهاء قانون قيصر؟ هذا ما أبحثه مع ضيوفي لهذه الحلقة، وهما السيد ألكسندر لونغلويز الكاتب والباحث السياسي ينضم إلينا من نيويورك، ومن أوكلاند في نيوزيلندا ينضم إلينا الدكتور كرم شعار الباحث المختص بالشأن السوري. ابقوا معنا لمتابعة هذه الحلقة. أبدأ هذه الحلقة مع ضيفي السيد ألكسندر لونغلويز الباحث والمحلل السياسي ينضم إلينا من نيويورك. سيد ألكسندر، جدل كبير حول قانون قيصر هذه الأيام، نسمعه من محللين من مختصين بالشأن السوري وأيضا من سوريين على الأرض يطالبون بإنهاء العقوبات وإلغاء قانون قيصر. أولا، هل يؤثر قانون قيصر؟ هل تؤثر العقوبات فعلا على عملية إيصال المساعدات الإنسانية لشمال سوريا، وفي هذه الحالة شمال غرب سوريا المتضرر من الزلزال؟
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, to start, I think that targeted sanctions on war criminals and those allied with the regime are good as long as they do not impact the average Syrian, right? I think that the response that we've seen with the earthquake has actually been quite positive. We've seen a number of countries outside of Syria's Damascus's typical kind of close allies actually commit aid in one way or another, which is promising. I think that at the same time, what we see very often with sanctions regimes around the world is it creates a level of risk that is sometimes, it oftentimes scares specific CSOs, NGOs away, right? There's a risk aversion to sanctions. And when you have sanctions on things like the central bank of Syria, that can have a pretty profound impact on how the average CSO or aid operation views its ability to operate in a country. And so, the issue here very oftentimes is when you have sector-wide sanctions, which is a thing in Syria, regardless of what, the political conversations that we have about the sanctions and what they really are in Syria. There are sector-wide sanctions that, alongside those financial sanctions on the central bank, do make it difficult for the average CSO to respond effectively and strategically to any given crisis. But another point that I want to make that I think is really important here has to do with actually the state of infrastructure in the country in the first place. And so the ability of a country like Syria to react to a natural disaster like the earthquake is drastically impacted by its inability to have any critical infrastructure throughout the war. And we know that the regime plays a major role in this. The regime, along with Russia and its allies, did bomb critical infrastructure, including hospitals, including a number of very important sites for civilians. But the issue that we have today is that a country like Syria cannot respond as effectively either without this infrastructure rebuilt, right? So we're talking, when you look at the cholera outbreak as one example, the water pumps along the Euphrates were not reconstructed, are not functional, and this was likely a major reason why cholera was able to spread as quickly as it did throughout the country, because people were forced to resort to water bottle companies that were likely not being safe in how they were actually handling water and then selling it to people. And so when we talk about sanctions, we need to think about the kind of second and third effects, right? Not just the immediate, can humanitarian aid get into a country? It's how are CSOs and NGOs looking at this, as well as private entities that may have, heavy equipment for removing debris that can save people, or getting food into a country, or providing medical services. Now, I know sanctions don't target medical or food when it comes to Syria, but understanding these things are really important.
هناك انتقادات لاذعة ومباشرة للحكومات الغربية في إطار الحملة المطالبة برفع العقوبات عن سوريا والمعاناة التي نراها اليوم بالفيديوهات المنتشرة للسوريين. يعني نرى المساعدات التي تصل إلى تركيا، نرى قدرة الحكومات الغربية على مساعدة الشعب التركي ونقارنها بما يصل إلى سوريا ونشعر بفارق كبير. وهناك لوم كبير للحكومات الغربية على شح المساعدات الواصلة للشعب السوري، هل تغير هذه الكارثة الإنسانية الكبيرة رأي الحكومات الغربية بجدوى العقوبات وبأثر العقوبات، ونرى فعلا تغير سياسي تاريخي متعلق برفع العقوبات الغربية وتحديدا عقوبات قيصر عن سوريا؟
I think I don't think in the near term necessarily. The Biden administration did release a sanctions review in which it is trying to kind of reconceptualize sanctions regimes and centralize the well-being of innocent civilians, right? And these are important steps. Although I would question the progress on that review in places like Syria, places like Iran. And there's a lot of factors here, right? I mean, a number of these countries that are sanctioned directly impact each other, right? Like, I think sanctions on Iran caused Iran to make oil imports into Syria more expensive because they had to do that to bring in more money for themselves, causing the Syrian economy to spiral in the last few months, right? And so these things are interconnected. And it's another reason why I think that over time you could see some shifts away from sector-wide sanctions, but it's also difficult because the Syrian Central Bank did play a role and has played a role in financing the regime and helping it commit atrocities against its people. The issue is when you sanction the central bank of a country, you're inherently going to cause a balance of payments issue if that country does not reform its own political systems before that happens. And that's the point of sanctions, right? If you don't create reform, then you create problems that eventually force reform or otherwise. And so I think that although we've seen a review, I don't think that it is going to be all that easy to have a shift in the near term, maybe the medium to long term, but also the Caesar sanctions are a legislative act, right? It's a piece of legislation out of the U.S. Congress. And so the president has broad discretion still on how he wants to implement that or how they want to implement that. But there's still going to be political pressure that comes with that goes beyond just executive decisions when it comes to sanctions as well. So near term, I don't see a major shift, although I would like to see it, at least a rethink. I think there's middle ground here that is very reasonable in terms of how we want to look at sanctions and their impact on civilians and humanitarian responses and the general economy of Syria and other countries. But I think political forces today don't necessarily allow for that in the near term, unfortunately.
ألكسندر، الفساد مشكلة كبيرة تعاني منها سوريا. ربما الفساد هو أصل المشكلة في كل ما حدث ويحدث منذ عام 2011 وقبل ذلك أيضا. هل هناك آلية اليوم تضمن أن المساعدات التي تصل إلى الحكومة السورية لن تباع في السوق السوداء؟ يعني رأينا كثيرا في الماضي مساعدات الأمم المتحدة التي كتب عليها غير مخصص للبيع تباع فعلا في الأسواق السورية في مناطق سيطرة النظام السوري. هل من آلية تضمن أن المساعدات التي تصل حاليا لن تباع، لن يستفيد منها كبار المسؤولين، ولن تصل بطبيعة الحال إلى من يحتاجها فعلا؟ لأنه هناك رغم الحديث عن شح المساعدات هناك مساعدات تصل. نتحدث عن 100 مليون دولار قدمتها دولة الإمارات، نتحدث عن ملايين دولارات قدمتها أيضا دول خليجية ودول عربية أخرى. كيف يضمن المانح اليوم لسوريا بأن هذه المساعدات ستصل فعلا إلى من هو بحاجة إليها؟
No, right, exactly. And this is what makes it an impossible issue in some respects. The regime does steal aid and has stolen aid. It has politicized aid itself. And this is a major issue, right? And so when it comes to corruption and the regime using aid to its own benefit, and frankly, sometimes using financial flows to its own benefit as well, which has been well documented in reports by CSIS and other really wonderful organizations working on Syria in the last few months, it becomes really difficult to kind of justify, sanctions relief in the first place. There are some mechanisms to monitor this, but they are not good enough. Especially within the UN system, unfortunately. And so for me, I don't typically advocate for, for example, you've seen like calls for individual donations to local organizations in response to the earthquake. I typically don't and will not advocate for donations to UN agencies right now. We've just seen that the UN is incapable of monitoring itself. And this is due to the fact that Syria is just simply not a high priority, I don't think. I mean, we see that it's a major priority and you see major, asks in terms of spending. But in terms of political priorities, I don't know if it is at a level that it needs to be at for these monitoring systems that are in place to be severely improved, because the regime has found ways around this. It's that simple. It's found ways around it, and that is another major reason why people don't get aid in regime areas. In my attempts to try to find local organizations to donate to in regime areas that could help people directly, I mean, it's almost impossible. It's very, very hard to find organizations that don't have something, unfortunately, either the regime hand involved or direct control of the regime. And that's just the reality of the situation. And I don't know the best way around that without a more increased, political prioritization of Syria and aid flows.
شكرا جزيلا لك ضيفي السيد ألكسندر لونغلويس، كنت معنا من نيويورك.
Thank you.